Good afternoon. Welcome to Be Well. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jonathan from your Y, and I'm honored to bring you these conversations with leaders in their field related to living mindfully. As your moderator, I come to you with 30 plus years of experience in mindfulness, wellness, and mental health. I want to start off with a quote, a very simple quote by Thich Nhat Hanh. And I ask you as we begin to feel into this just for a moment. To be mindful is to be truly alive, present, at one with those around you and with what you are doing. I feel this is relevant to today, maybe more than any time in our recent history. We're in a time now to listen, to learn, to be with uncomfort, to be open to those that we see as being different than ourselves. The hope would be that this can guide us towards a responsible action for social justice. Throughout our conversation, I encourage you to use the chat function so you can be a part of this conversation. Some prefer the gallery view at the top as the optimal experience for viewing. So today's topic, stand together against hate. Today's guest is Christopher Tenorio, Chair of San Diego Regional Hate Coalition. Welcome, Christopher.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
I want to give you just a sketch of Christopher's background. Very accomplished. He's a federal prosecutor specializing in the investigation of criminal civil rights crimes, a trial attorney with the United States Department of Justice and Civil Rights Division. Christopher helped prosecute the largest modern day slavery case in the United States. This resulted in national attention being brought to bear on human trafficking and the epidemic of such. He's received the Attorney General's highest award as a federal prosecutor in litigation at the Department of Justice. Mr. Tenorio served as counsel to former Deputy Attorney Eric Holder. He also oversaw the Civil Rights Division, participated in President Clinton's White House Interagency Working Group on Human Rights. We're fortunate since 1999 to have Mr. Tenorio as an assistant U.S. attorney here in San Diego in the as a civil rights coordinator. He's led task force, conferences, taught internationally on the investigation and prosecution of civil rights crimes. As I begin today, I recognize for me it's difficult through my words to adequately represent the period that we've come to. We've seen protests across the nation in response to the difficulty there.
I see you now.
Thank you. So Mr. Floyd's death and many other well-reported ones over the past several years, including those of Eric Gardner, Michael Brown, Laquan McDonald, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, and Freddie Gray, Alton Sterling, Orlando Castillo, Gordon Edwards, Stephon Clark, Tatiana Jefferson, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd now have brought us what is truly the most intense period of social unrest in the United States since the late 60s. With the biggest peaceful protests we've seen happening this past weekend. Christopher, you've spent your whole career advocating and defending our civil rights, civil liberties. How best do we take on this moment in time as a society to truly stand up and unite for Black Lives Matter?
You know, it really is a special time going on right now because we've seen this public support for what a lot of us in the civil rights areas have been fighting for and advocating for, or even enforcing. I've been doing it for almost 25 years. And sometimes the conversation is at the forefront, sometimes it fades into the background. And more than ever, we're seeing the public support for a lot of the issues, whether it's um, pattern and practice issues on excessive force, hate crimes, which is really a big concern at the beginning of the pandemic, and of course now, and the underlying issues on both those, which could be inherent bias ingrained in our society and in our institutions. So it's been, I think, welcome to myself and others in institutions like the Department of Justice to hear the public support for our mission and perhaps changes that are long overdue or require some more attention so we can see how to fix them.
So I think part of what I'm seeing and others at this point in time is the curtain has been rolled back further. It often comes rolled back and then it gets covered again. Just the systemic problem of racism, discrimination in the justice system. We see a disproportionate number of people of color pulled over, arrested, in prison. What can we do to address this in a sincere, a profound way versus you know, bring about real enacted change versus just pledging to make change?
You know, I think with any large institution, whether it's US Congress, state legislatures, or institutions like the Department of Justice, we've identified a lot of the issues, but sometimes there's not a lot of public pressure to make those changes. And I think these protests are very loud and clear and coming across to ears that maybe in the past would not have listened or would be able to put it aside as for another day. And that's no longer the case. For example, there are a lot of issues we've heard in the news about police collective bargaining agreements in which they're able to kind of cut in half maybe suggested punishments for policy violations or excessive force violations. That was known to people like myself that would prosecute those types of cases, but not much to the public. And therefore they were kind of ingrained areas that would prevent a lot of punishment and long-term changes to police practices. Now that that's getting attention and you're seeing the public really say, you know, this is keeping systemic change from happening. There's people listening to that wouldn't before. So I think that's the greatest thing about what's going on now, and what people can continue doing is let their voices be heard so that the institutions listen.
That's an excellent point. And it kind of goes to, there's been a lot of discussion about the need for much more of a critical review of our policy, our policing methods, how we train law enforcement, the use of force, deadly force, addressing police brutality. And so if you will, comment to those practices and how best to address that.
Sure. You know, part of it is that the systems have been in place. As you mentioned, I'm a federal prosecutor here in San Diego, but before that, I was with the Civil Rights Division out of Main Justice in Washington, D.C. The Civil Rights Division is divided into between about a dozen sections. I was with the criminal section, so we enforce the criminal civil rights violations. But there's one section in particular called the Special Litigation Section. And what they do is they work with statutes that allow them to investigate law enforcement agencies around the country and determine what policy changes or institutional changes need to be enacted, whether it's a difference in hiring or in training or in practices. For example, the NYPD, they're still dealing with quota systems of how many summons or arrests police officers would have to make. The Civil Rights Division came in and said, you know, this is illegal. This leads to disproportionate arrests in communities of color. There is a political pushback to that in some circles that says, you know, these types of investigations kind of decline the morale in police departments. Whereas when we did those investigations, we heard quite the opposite. You hear from a lot of good officers who say, you know, we can't enact this institutional change ourselves. We need an outside voice to come in and give us an idea. These are the things that have worked in other departments. Here's how you can improve here. So that ability has been out. There's been, they've been held back a little bit in recent years, but there's that ability to go in and make agreements with departments, which they've done successfully in cities like New Orleans, I think Columbus, Ohio, in years past. And they certainly helped out in Ferguson, Missouri after the incident there a handful of years back. Those are one of the things, and they can enter consent decrees with those departments to say, these are the number of things that we can do. But, you know, we can have them come in, but there's also outside organizations that have brought private lawsuits and can come up with agreements. And what I think we can take advantage of the atmosphere now, where a lot of departments are saying, okay, we're willing to come to the table and figure out what reforms are possible. Let's talk about it. So a lot of city and county committees, we're seeing that here in San Diego, are getting reinvigorated to come up with those ideas for police reform.
That's wonderful. It's an interesting aspect that you speak to, because at the same time there is a lot of discussion about defunding police departments and or shifting the funding that would go to police departments in different ways. And so what I hear you saying is that there's some mechanisms at this point in time, whether through civil lawsuits, other institutions of law that can bring about the change, bringing the police officers union to the table. There's a greater receptivity to look at how to do things differently. What are your thoughts about the funding of the police departments and whether they should be defunded or funds should go elsewhere?
Well, you know, I think there's a lot of information, actually, both academic and practical information from the US Department of Justice that's been looking at this issue for years and years. I mean, back when I was in the administration in the late 90s, we had conferences, a national conference on policing issues. And they would come up with potential solutions that were tried in some departments and tweaked if they didn't work correctly. And a lot of them came up with ideas of shifting funding to other types of department that would do similar similar services that police departments are burdened with now. Not burdened, that's not the right word, but having to take care of mental health issues or simple peacekeeping issues, whether it's responding to calls, and not training every police officer in how to respond with force only and immediately. And regarding funding, there's different positions on that. And I think that a lot of what's being talked about is moving some funding to social programs. But there's also been evidence that increasing pay for certain police officers would allow an improvement in those that apply to become police officers, and recruiting well-educated and innovative officers. So that's also part of the solution. Not necessarily more police, but better trained and paying for the training that happens. That could come from more funding. So it's a bit of an irony, and I've seen discussion on both sides. And so it's not really a simple solution of defund the police. It's kind of, let's defund these programs and perhaps fund better other aspects such as training.
I appreciate that. I've heard conversations about more training on de-escalation, as you reference with mental health issues out there. If the training has been that you address this in a particular way, that can be very ineffectual and also be deadly in certain circumstances, because those officers may not have been trained appropriately how best to take that on. I don't know if you're familiar, I had heard something on NPR earlier today about the Camden, New Jersey Police Department, and how back some years ago, they did disband the police department there because of systemic issues with how they were fulfilling their role in the community. And since then, they're now being held out as one of the examples for others in terms of how to go about more community-based relationships and community-based policing.
I think that's right. I did see the article, at least the headline that you're talking about, and I'm familiar with the concept in general. And I know Minneapolis is going to be looking to Camden in particular as a model as they're going to start restructuring what they have. And I'm, I may be, I may be mistaken, but I think Camden was also one of those municipalities that worked with the Civil Rights Division to just kind of help them develop community policing issues. And one of the things that you did touch upon, I know for a fact that the Civil Rights Division has gone to different departments to train or at least point them in the direction for training on dealing with people with disabilities. Because as you can imagine, when you're encountering a situation that might be volatile, whether it's a domestic violence call or a minor trespassing, if you're dealing with someone with mental health issues, they need to be treated in certain ways and handled in certain ways so it doesn't escalate and therefore lead to excessive force. And sometimes it's a matter of policy, de-escalation policies. Sometimes it's a matter of bringing in experts, therapists at the same time as the police officers to help that individual calm down, or how to speak with them, because that only a trained individual would know how to do. So those are definitely issues that are on the table, and of course require more funding in order to have someone available. For example, I think San Diego Police Department, I don't know this offhand, but I know they have maybe, well, they have few of these individuals. So if they're on a one call and you need them for somewhere else, you know, you might be short staffed.
Interesting. I know, I think we're all aware that the focus has been on the institution of law enforcement, which has been representing ongoing as well as the latest example of violence and racial oppression. And the problem of hate in our society doesn't just lie with this institution. And so it's easy for us, maybe not easy, but we can just point the finger and say it's all there, and then we don't have to take any responsibility for our involvement in it. But if you will, Christopher, speak to how you view hate in our society and how hate has come about and been propagated.
Well, you bring up a good point, and I think it's one of the things that we want to address in the San Diego Regional Hate Crimes Coalition about inherent bias. You know, there's been a lot of academic studies of how we all carry bias from our exposure culturally to social media and movies, even songs, and how we see ourselves and others, and assumptions that are made when we see people. We're seeing the ugly parts of that. For example, we've had a few town halls recently how Asian Americans are really being targeted as potential carriers of COVID-19. The conspiracy theories against the Jewish community for perhaps releasing the virus. These are the more extreme things, but even the more basic ideas, when we are walking down a street and we see someone of a particular race, we might want to cross the street because of maybe something that we believe they might not belong in this neighborhood. Where we see that in policing, I think could be in assumptions about people from certain races and backgrounds that might be more likely to pull a gun in the eyes of police wrongly, or based on preconceptions. When we look at cases for excessive force, they're very difficult to prove and prosecute. And you're hearing a lot about this now, why it's not done more often. One of the reasons is you have to prove the willfulness, the intent of willfulness, that they're doing, that they're violating a constitutional right intentionally. And a lot of times what will happen is law enforcement is reacting too quickly, using force too quickly, because they're assuming that a force is going to be used against them. And sometimes those are based on misconceptions of the race of the individual that they're addressing. And that's why I think one of the underlying issues that the African American community and other communities of color receive more excessive force in general, and this is all speaking generally by law enforcement, because of, even if you can't point to a direct racist, all of us have inherent biases that we need to recognize and work with, and maybe not act as quickly. So those are some
So,
of the things we're working on. Yes.
so I'm just thinking, we all have, as you said, certain biases. Often we're blind to those biases unless it gets reflected back to us in some way. Through your professional experience, how do we become more aware individually of what biases that we hold in society?
You know, it's funny, there's of course studies where they show uh, blood pressure, how you react to seeing different photos of different individuals and races and identify. But I think even more in a more innocuous way, I think we need to acknowledge that in ourselves. Like you said, we all have these biases, and it doesn't make us bad persons necessarily, but it also causes us to have to do a little self-reflection and wonder, why do I feel this way? Why am I is my first reaction to seeing someone that looks a certain way, and how can I respond to that? You know, one of our guiding principle at the San Diego Regional Hate Crimes Coalition is a quote from Martin Luther King that basically says, people fear each other because they don't know each other, and they don't know each other because they haven't communicated with each other. And part of it is just going back to basic empathy. More, once you communicate with people and know people, and kind of say, all right, I might be of a different religion than this person, but now I know people like unlike me, and there's no difference. And of course, these things are obvious, but a lot of it just comes from communicating with each other and seeing what we have in common, as simple as that sounds.
As you shared that, I was thinking about there was a student that I was working with that was African American, and he wrote a poem about his experience walking down the street, and was saying that his classmates don't have to walk down the street and be concerned that others are going to walk across the street when they see him coming, and to see fear in people's eyes and seeing this projection of they think I'm going to steal their purse or cause them some bodily harm, and just the different, and it was helpful to share that with me and his classmates because a white person wouldn't have that same experience. And so to be able to become more aware of those that are different than ourselves, that we see as different in ourselves, and the path that they walk and what that's like. So I appreciate what you're sharing in terms of Martin Luther King's quote, and that is the guiding principle of the San Diego Regional Hate Coalition. If you would, I know there is a certain approach to how the coalition looks at making a difference in terms of hate in our society, with the goal of preventing hate and bringing us together more collaboratively. If you would, just share about the outreach, the education, the dialogue that is fostered.
Sure. So the coalition, it includes a lot of us in law enforcement, agencies, myself from the U.S. Attorney's Office, and representatives from the district attorney, city attorney, a lot of the police departments and sheriff's office and FBI. But we also have a lot of community-based organizations, non-governmental organizations that represent different communities, ranging from the Islamic Center of San Diego, the Chicano Federation, the ADL, and the LGBTQ community, the Alliance is with us. What we do is talk about not only what hate crimes are, and those of us in law enforcement say, okay, once it gets to it crosses the line and becomes a crime, this is how we evaluate it and how we would respond. But our primarily focus is, let's not even get that far. Let's see how we can prevent it from happening. So we've had a series of community town halls, both to tell them what the law is, what their rights are to come forward and get resources as either victims or witnesses of hate crimes, and what, even if it doesn't cross that line, if it's a hate incident, meaning it may not be a crime, it may be someone driving by and yelling out a car window, you know, go back to your country, or some other derogatory term to people. Those aren't, maybe not crimes, but they're hate incidents. They're incidents motivated by bias and discrimination. And we do need to know about those things too, because when we're proving a hate crime, we have to prove that the person's motivated by a bias or an intent, discriminatory intent. And if there's other evidence in the past where they've expressed that, even though that in itself is not criminal, it's evidence of their intent later on. So that's one of the things, but it's also to let them know about resources available to victims of crime that does not come along unless they report, something. It doesn't have to turn to a prosecution, but at least has to be reported. So that's part of it. And we're looking to other possibilities of town halls, whether it's talking about inherent bias that leads to excessive force or hate crimes, and leaving it open to our members to see what would best serve our community at large and their individual communities that they represent.
What I recognize is that as you're keeping that pulse on where those hate incidents are, you're able to look at early intervention and even prevention by going into those communities, so it doesn't become something that spreads and becomes normalized in those particular areas. Share, if you would, just about the community collaboration and how you're trying to bring about this collective understanding. I know you spoke to, as you did just a moment ago, wanting to foster these town hall meetings in our community. And I would think others would like to know how they could either participate in those, how they could be a part of the coalition, as well as to learn more about the resources.
Part of the silver lining, if you will, about what's come out recently, we put out a public service announcement that the Union Tribune published a week ago Sunday, and it kind of led people to what we support and what we're against. Yes, that's it exactly. And it's really nice. And on the online version, if you click onto our website, it brings you to our website, which frankly speaking, isn't that robust. It's all me putting stuff up when I can. But what it does do is it talks about our events when they're available. And if someone wants to join the coalition, there's a link to email us. So it's open to just about anyone that, representing a committee or a group, but we have, representatives from the County Department of Education and the Humane Society and a lot of the community colleges and universities, because of hate crime issues that touch upon their communities or their agencies. And individual, you don't have to represent an agency or anything either. We have representatives from the African American community and the Chicano community that represent just each other, or perhaps community leaders, and have their own audience that they can send out information to. So if some groups want speakers just to come, we're all ready to go, from law enforcement or the community groups. I've done quite a few since the pandemic hit, one for San Diego State and for the Asian American community, and just to talk about discrete issues about what hate crimes are, or perhaps what law enforcement's doing, or how to get resources.
That's excellent. And that website, sdnohate.org, will come up again on the deck at the end, so you can write that down. Christopher, how can you share what we can do today to further resolve racial injustice? What concrete steps that we could, all of us individually and collectively, move forward with to hopefully bring about sustaining change in this area?
It's funny that some of the best things we can do is this talking and collaborating like we're doing right now. And I think one of the most reassuring things we've seen about the protests is seeing the diversity of the people walking and supporting African Americans. We've seen the biggest changes when other communities are supporting those that may be targeted, especially right now. I'll give an example. When after 9/11, the Arab community was really hit hard, discriminated against very hard, and there were a lot of arrests and questioning of them here. And the first ones that came to their aid was the Japanese American organizations here locally, because of their history dealing with detention camps here in California and elsewhere, and knowing how you can be targeted just because of your national identity and how you look. And we're seeing that now. Everyone kind of stood behind the Asian American community from our coalition at the beginning of this pandemic because they were really being targeted. And now everyone, of course, is coming to the aid, or not to the aid, but to the support of the African American community. So that has been helpful for, not to avoid the question, but a lot of that, I think, to join these groups and to listen and to see how they suggest you can help them is the best thing to do. And I think also putting, as I mentioned earlier, pressure on the institutions to listen to some of the reform proposals that have been out there and have been ignored, and now to say, no, we as your constituents want you to listen to these reforms that have been proposed and become educated on what those are, maybe how the pros and cons of certain ones and what should be changed. And maybe your particular community, which might be different than it is in, the East Coast or the Southwest or Northeast. In particular here, because of our border situation, maybe the composition of our community, there are certain things that we need that you may not need in New York City. So I think self-education, get your voices known, and support communities other than your own that you are, you see what they're dealing with, and you support them.
That's an excellent blueprint how we really can stand united against hate. Christopher, if you will, I have a couple questions that have come in. Your position on independent commissions reviewing San Diego policing.
It's a tough question for me because I'm in the federal side. I can speak as a private individual and support those. What we do, this might help to know. On the federal government, we can review excessive force cases by law enforcement, and that includes local law enforcement. So a lot of times what we do is we see what's done on their side, and luckily in San Diego, they've been pretty robust in reviewing excessive force cases. A lot of localities where the federal government's the only one that goes in. But we review those to make sure everything's done. If there's further investigation that's needed, the FBI can do that. I think private individuals on review boards is a good thing if it allows for a bit of independence. And I think they also take the role of what I was mentioning earlier, that the Civil Rights Division can come in and do wholesale evaluations of potential policy changes that they could recommend. But again, that's on the state side, which I wouldn't have involvement in their policy changes unless the Civil Rights Division was invited in.
Great. There is a question for me regarding the poem that I shared. I'd love to get that out. I'll look at the best mechanism to get it out to everybody. If you're also welcome just to email me at jcollopy@ymca.org. And if not, to be well, but feel free to email me and I will send you that poem. Christopher, last question for you, if you will. Your judicial viewpoint relating to what does healing begin to look like for our country, and where do we start?
Boy, I think we're on our way. I think there was a justifiable anger that we felt the last two weeks, and it's kind of the processes of grieving, of getting frustrated and angry, and not to suggest that we need acceptance anytime soon, but we're on our way of at least listening. And I think seeing the widespread support across all demographics for Black Lives Matter is something that's been helpful, both as a country and then for me as an individual that enforces these civil rights laws. It's also incumbent upon us to change our institutions from within, and it's not always easy to get the resources we need to push certain prosecutions and investigations. But when the institutions see that the public demands it, it makes our job easier too. And so I'm just hoping that this is an inflection point and that we see change. You know, I've heard a commentary that it is an inflection point, but I've also heard that, you know, it depends on how much action is being taken after that, and that's exactly right. We need to take advantage, and the ongoing dialogue from the public is certainly going to help so that it supports us to make changes from within.
Excellent. In closing, any other comments that you'd like to leave us with? I really appreciate what you've offered thus far, but anything in closing from you?
No, I would, other than I'd really encourage everyone to keep an ear open, you know, listen to others. We all assume we know what the right answer is, and we're all limited in our own experience and our own background. And again, this isn't to criticize anybody. We all have these inherent biases and our limitations of what we see. So it's really helpful to hear the experiences of others that might come from backgrounds or experiences different than our own, and it opens our eyes to know, okay, those are good solutions that I didn't even think of, and perhaps different approaches that we can take, whether it's enforcing the law, reforming police departments, or just responding to people in need. And that certainly we've seen a lot of help and a lot of positive changes working with people in the Hate Crimes Coalition.
Excellent. I will put into the chat my email so it's easier to get to me. Christopher, I really appreciate the work that you're doing with the Justice Department and civil rights and your involvement in our community. So thank you for being with us today. I wanted to circle back and offer a reflection I had today, because the Be Well is really meant to live a life mindfully. And so as I think of mindfulness, I think of how we use our breath to be our guide. And my hope is moving forward, we can reflect on and not take for granted, truly, the ability to breathe freely. I appreciate you being here to listen, to participate. And this is only the beginning. But please, until we meet again, be well and thank you very much. Christopher, thank you, sir.
Thank you, my pleasure.